Thank you all for coming out. God bless the great state of New Hampshire. I spent all of last week down in Washington, D.C. So it is great to be back in America. Now, Jennifer, I enjoyed hearing that you said that you thought New Hampshire was ready for Hillary. You know, I'm actually told that this dinner tried to get Hillary to come speak. Unfortunately, they couldn't find a foreign nation to foot the bill. But I will say we've seen some exciting news. Ready for Hillary has announced their new director of email security. Lois Lerner now has a job. I'm thrilled to be back in New Hampshire with so many friends. I appreciate y'all's being here. These are extraordinary times. They're remarkable times. Every one of us is here. We came out tonight because we're deeply concerned about the direction of this country. Every one of us is here because we're concerned about our kids and grandkids. There is right now, I think, an urgency to politics, unlike anything any of us have ever seen before. This next election in 2016, I believe it is now or never. I don't think we've reached the point of no return yet, but we are close. There comes a point where the hole's too deep. There comes a point where the debt is too great, where our liberties have been too far eroded, where the world is too far gone. And I believe if we continue 4 or 8 more years down this current path, we will risk losing the greatest country in the history of the world. Now, the men and women here are assembled because none of us are willing to let that happen. None of us are willing to go quietly into the night. None of us are willing to let go and give up on the United States of America. You know, to underscore how extraordinary this moment is, today, for the first time in history, a majority of Americans, 65%, believe that our kids will have a worse life than we did. I want you to think about that. In centuries of our nation's history, that has never been true until right now, this instant. It may be the most un-American idea there has ever been. The basic American ideal back in the 1700s and today has been that our kids would have a better life than we did, and their kids would have a better life than they did. There's something extraordinary. So I want to talk to y'all about how we turn that around, and I want to come to you with a voice of hope and optimism. I think the central challenge in this country in 2016 and going forward is how do we reignite the miracle that is America? And I'm going to suggest we need to do 3 things to make that happen. Number 1, bring back jobs and growth and opportunity. My number 1 priority since showing up in the Senate has been economic growth. Because economic growth is foundational to everything else. And I can tell you, across the state of Texas, it doesn't matter if you're in East Texas or West Texas or the Panhandle or the Valley, the top priority is jobs and growth. And that ought to be a bipartisan priority. That ought to bring us all together and say, look, regardless of what we think on other issues, if we have small businesses prospering and growing and creating jobs and opportunity, that lifts all ships. Now, everyone here knows growth doesn't come from government. Growth comes from the men and women in this room, from the private sector. But government is awfully good at screwing it up. And the two most effective levers that government has to facilitate the private sector, to facilitate small businesses creating jobs, are tax reform and regulatory reform. Now, tax reform. Right now, the current IRS code, you know, there are more words in the IRS code than in the Bible. Not a one of them is as good. I'll tell you the best and simplest tax reform. We should abolish the IRS. We should move to a simple flat tax that's fair and that lets every American fill out his or her taxes on a postcard.
That's right. Yes.
Now, there are 110,000 agents at the IRS. We need to padlock that building and put all 110,000 agents on our southern border. Now, I say that somewhat tongue-in-cheek to our friends from the Fourth Estate who are with us. But I want you to think for a second. Imagine you had traveled thousands of miles in the blazing sun. Imagine you're swimming across the Rio Grande, and the first thing you see is 110,000 IRS agents. You turn around and go home too. And when it comes to regulatory reform, we have seen over the last 6 years federal regulators descending on small businesses like locusts.
That's right.
You know, I was out once in West Texas, and I said the only difference is you can't use pesticide on the regulators. And an old Texas farmer looked at me and said, "Want to bet?" I got to admit that kind of seems like an attitude folks here in the North Country would understand. The single most important regulatory reform, we need to repeal every word of Obamacare. Look, Obamacare is a train wreck. It is a disaster. 5 years ago, maybe reasonable minds could have differed on whether this thing might have worked. Today, we've seen millions of people lose their jobs, millions of people forced into part-time work, millions of people lose their health insurance, lose their doctors, pay higher and higher insurance premiums. You know, some months ago, I was in Nebraska. It's a big rally. It was out in North Platte, Nebraska. Over 1,000 people out in the countryside in North Platte. A young woman came up to me and she hugged my neck. She said, "Ted, I'm a single mom." She said, "I've got 6 kids at home. My husband left me and he's not paying child support." She said, "I'm right now working 5 different jobs. Not a one of them is even 30 hours a week because Obamacare kicks in at 30 hours a week." She started to choke up. She said, "I'm having a hard time keeping clothes on the backs of my kids. But the single hardest thing is I never get to see my kids. I go from job to job to job, and they don't get the mom that they need and they deserve." Look, that's who we're fighting for. That's who Obamacare is hurting. It's the people who are struggling to achieve a better life. Our first priority needs to be to bring back jobs and growth and opportunity. Our second priority is to defend our constitutional liberties. All of them. The First Amendment, the right to free speech. You know, the IRS has been demanding of citizen groups, tell us what books you're reading. Tell us the content of your prayers. You know what? The federal government has no business asking any American the content of our prayers. You look at the assault on religious liberty that every one of us is seeing. Sadly, it was manifested in my hometown of Houston, when just a few months ago the city of Houston subpoenaed 5 pastors. Issued subpoenas to the pastors to hand over their sermons. Now I got to note, listen, if we'd gone out and said this, if I'd gone on Fox News and said, the government's going to come and subpoena pastors, they'd have dismissed me as some black helicopter conspiracy kook. And yet there was the city of Houston ordering pastors to hand over their sermons, their sermon notes, and any correspondence or discussions they had concerning those sermons. Well, let me tell you a story that'll lift you up. It was Wednesday of that week, and I called our pastor. Heidi and I are members of First Baptist Church in Houston. I called our pastor, Pastor Greg. I said, "You've seen what happened?" And he said, "Oh yeah, I've seen what happened. I've been praying about it all morning." And I said, "Well, tomorrow we want to organize a rally of pastors throughout the city of Houston to stand for religious liberty. We'd like to do it tomorrow, Thursday at 11 a.m. And I wanted to ask you if it's okay if we do it at the church. We'd like to host the rally for pastors there." My pastor begins laughing. And he says, "You know, Ted, Scripture says God has ordered our steps long before we are aware of it. A month ago," he says, "God put on my heart we needed to pray for our city. So I reached out and I invited pastors from all over the city to come pray for the city. There are 50 pastors coming to my office tomorrow at 10 a.m. I got to tell you, that was powerful. I mean, we're both sitting there going, wow. So at 10 a.m. I joined the pastors and we dropped to our knees. We prayed for our city for an hour. Then we went down to a rally, had 50 pastors across racial and ethnic lines, socioeconomic lines, denomination, 300-400 people in the rally, 50 pastors. I mean, we even had First Baptist and Second Baptist together. And that ain't easy. But we stood together and said, Caesar has no jurisdiction over the pulpit.
That's right. That's right.
And when you subpoena one pastor, you subpoena every pastor. And I'll tell you, the light and heat and attention that came down on the city of Houston was so intense that within a week, the city withdrew the subpoenas and abandoned the challenge altogether. We're a country that was founded on religious liberty. And the federal government should not be coming after it. We need to defend the Second Amendment. Nobody here likes the Second Amendment? I was going to say, I don't believe that for a minute. I'm pretty sure New Hampshire's definition of gun control is kind of like what it is in Texas. Gun control means hitting what you aim at. We need to defend the Fourth and Fifth Amendments, our right to privacy.
That's right. That's right.
How many of y'all have your cell phones? Let me ask you, please leave your cell phones on. I want to make sure President Obama hears every word we say to him. We need to defend the 10th Amendment.
Yes.
Or as President Obama calls it, the what? The fundamental protection that says the powers not given to the federal government are reserved to the states or to the people. That means there are certain core functions the federal government is given that it needs to do well. We need to protect our nation. We need to support the armed forces. We need to secure the border. But there are certain functions the federal government has no business sticking its nose in the middle of, and right at the top of that list is education. And we need to repeal every word of Common Core. Besides, we have a Common Core in this country. It's called the Constitution of the United States. The third thing we need to do is restore America's leadership in the world. You know, for 6 years, we have seen the consequences of the Obama-Clinton foreign policy. Leading from behind is a manifest disaster. Over the last 6 years, America has receded from leadership in the world. We have abandoned our friends and allies. And our enemies no longer fear or respect us. You cannot win a war on radical Islamic terrorism with a president who is unwilling to utter the words radical Islamic terrorism. You know, just a few weeks ago, following the horrific terrorist attack in Paris, President Obama described that attack as a, quote, random act of violence. When a radical Islamist goes into a kosher deli with a meat cleaver seeking to murder Jews because of their Jewish faith, there's nothing random about it whatsoever. Likewise, just a few weeks ago, when 21 Coptic Christians in Egypt were beheaded, the White House said that 21 citizens had been murdered because of their Egyptian citizenship. They weren't murdered because they were Egyptian. They were murdered because of their Christian faith. That's right. Pope Francis powerfully said, their blood confesses Jesus Christ. And the single gravest threat facing the national security of America today is the threat of Iran acquiring nuclear weapons. Now, 2 weeks ago, I was honored to sit on the floor of the House of Representatives and listen to Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who gave an extraordinary address before Congress. I have to say, walking out, what struck me is that we are hearing echoes of history. We are hearing echoes of Munich in 1938. And the adjective that has been most frequently applied to Prime Minister Netanyahu is Churchillian, because he is speaking with a clarity and a moral gravity. At least a dozen members of Congress said to me after his remarks, that is what a real leader sounds like. Now, instead of greeting our friend and ally, instead of standing with the nation of Israel, the White House threw a temper tantrum. The president refused to meet with the prime minister. In fact, the president said he didn't even watch the speech. Look, I got to say, Heidi and I, we've got a 4-year-old and 6-year-old. I'm kind of familiar with the strategy of, I can't hear you. But the President of the United States ought to be above that. And then this past week, I was proud to join with 46 other senators in sending a letter to Iran. Now, I'm not sure about it, but I kind of get the sense the White House is upset about this. The president publicly said he was embarrassed for the 47 senators. I got to admit, I was like, hot diggity damn, he can be embarrassed by something. Who knew? But you know, watching the hysterical reaction of the president and the Democrats invokes the words of Shakespeare. Methinks she doth protest too much. The 47 of us who joined in that letter, what did it say? The letter to Iran conveyed a very straightforward fact that under our Constitution, there are only two ways something can become a law. Either the President can negotiate a treaty that he then submits to the Senate and it is ratified by 2/3 of the Senate, or Congress can pass a law that the President signs into law.
That's right.
Those are the only two ways to make a law. If the President doesn't submit it to Congress, any agreement is not binding on the United States of America. Now, you know, it really is a sad thing that such a letter was necessary.
That's right, yeah. That's exactly right.
How many, all right, is there anyone here in junior high? All right, we'll go high school. All right, high school. Y'all are taught, okay, y'all are taught in high school, the Constitution, that a treaty, to become a treaty, has to go to the Senate and get confirmed by 2/3 of the Senate. Look, they're nodding. Okay, you're definitely nodding. You're nodding emphatically. President Obama has been the most lawless president this country has ever seen.
Amen.
Why did that letter prove necessary? Because the president has repeatedly said he's not going to follow the understanding of the Constitution that any student in junior high or high school civics has. Instead, he's going to refuse to submit this very bad deal with Iran to Congress for ratification. Now, that's lawless, and it's why it prompted a letter to make clear the Constitution is still the law in the United States of America. Now, the follow-up from the White House in response to 47 senators saying, follow the Constitution, is the White House is now floating that instead, the President is going to take this lousy deal with Iran that only accelerates Iran acquiring nuclear weapons.
Oh, wow.
Okay, that was Eric Holder. The administration is very unhappy with this line of argument. Instead of submitting it to Congress, the White House is saying they're going to go to the United Nations to try to end-run Congress and the American people. Iran's foreign minister, Zarif, in response to this letter, issued a lecture on international law. Don't you understand? International law binds nations, and if the president agrees to it, there's nothing you can do about it. Well, I will note, this is a topic that I happen to have more than a little bit of history with. Before I was elected to the Senate, I was the Solicitor General of the state of Texas, the chief lawyer for the state in front of the United States Supreme Court. I served in that role 5.5 years, and over again, Texas led the nation defending conservative principles before the U.S. Supreme Court.
Great.
We defended the Ten Commandments monument on the state capitol grounds and won 5-4. We defended the Pledge of Allegiance, the words "one nation under God," and won unanimously. We defended the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms, and won 5-4. We defended New Hampshire's parental notification law before the U.S. Supreme Court and won unanimously. But of all the battles, the biggest was a case called Medellin versus Texas. Medellin began with a horrific crime. 2 teenage girls who were murdered in Houston. And the case took a very, very strange turn because the World Court, the judicial arm of the United Nations, issued an order to the United States to reopen the convictions of 51 murderers across this country. It was the first time in history a foreign court has tried to bind the U.S. justice system. I argued Medellin before the Supreme Court twice. On the other side was the World Court, the United Nations, and 90 foreign nations that came in against the state of Texas. Also on the other side, I'm sorry to tell you, was the President of the United States. And it was not President Obama. It was President George W. Bush. Now listen, I think George Bush is a good man. He's an honorable man. But in this instance, he signed a 2-paragraph order that attempted to order the state courts to obey the World Court. Now, I got to admit, it's a fairly unusual situation for the state of Texas to be litigating against the President of the United States, who was a Texan, who was the former governor of Texas, who was a Republican and a friend. Yet I sat down with our Attorney General, and I'm proud that twice I stood before the U.S. Supreme Court with George W. Bush's lawyer on the other side, and we argued, number one, that the United Nations and the World Court has no authority over our justice system.
That's right.
And number two, that no President of the United States, Democrat or Republican, can give up the sovereignty of the American people. And we won 6-3. So this Iran deal matters for a lot of reasons. It is an acute threat to our national security. A nuclear Iran is an existential threat to the nation of Israel. And I would note, by the way, existential doesn't mean a Frenchman in black chain smoking. I like that because it takes a second. There's kind of a half-second delay. It means quite literally going to the existence of the nation of Israel. But it is also a grave threat to the national security of this country. Now, New Hampshire is going to play a critical role in the 2016 election. And one thing I would encourage each of you to ask is any candidate who shows up in front of you, either Republican or Democrat, the very simple question: if President Obama negotiates a bad deal with Iran that undermines our national security, that makes it more likely that Iran acquires nuclear weapons, and if he doesn't submit it to Congress, will you repudiate that agreement in January of 2017?
That's right.
And any candidate who is not willing to say yes, who is not willing to put the vital national security of this country above partisan interest, is not fit to be the commander-in-chief of this country. I want to close with 2 points. Number one, I told you that I'm very optimistic. Scriptures tell us there's nothing new under the sun. I think where we are today is very, very much like the late 1970s. I think the similarities between Barack Obama and Jimmy Carter are uncanny. Same disastrous economic policies, same misery, stagnation, malaise. Same feckless and arrogant and naive foreign policy. In fact, the exact same countries, Russia and Iran, openly laughing at and mocking the President of the United States. You know, the one person in America thrilled with the job Barack Obama's doing is Jimmy Carter. But that's tough to do. But let me tell you why that analogy gives me so much hope and optimism. Because that story had a happy ending. We remember what happened in the late 70s and 1980. A grassroots movement began to sweep the country. Millions of men and women who came together and became the Reagan Revolution. Now, it didn't come from Washington. Washington despised Ronald Reagan. By the way, if you see a candidate who Washington embraces, run and hide. It came from the American people. It swept up as a tsunami from the grassroots, and it turned this country around. We went from stagnant economic growth to, by 1984, booming growth at 7.2% a year. Millions of people lifted out of poverty and into prosperity in the American dream. Now, I want you to imagine for a second, for some of you who might think, some of the things Cruz is saying are pretty audacious. Abolish the IRS, really?
Really?
But you know, in Washington, that's viewed as pretty out there. Repeal Obamacare, really?
Yes.
I want you to imagine for a second, we were all in this room in 1979. And I want you to imagine that Ronald Reagan walked up to this podium and told each of you, we're going to take the top marginal tax rate of 70%. We're going to cut it to 28%. We're going to take the current stagnant economic growth for 4 years, averaging less than 1% a year, and within 4 years it'll be 7.2% a year. We're going to take our hostages languishing in Iran. They will be released the day I am sworn into office. And within a decade, we're going to win the Cold War, rebuild our military, and tear the Berlin Wall to the ground. Now look, according to Washington reasoning, that had been nuts. You can't do any of that. Everyone in Washington knows it. Compared to that, abolishing the IRS and repealing Obamacare, that ain't nothing. The reason I'm optimistic is the same thing that happened in 1980 is happening today. One of the real blessings of serving in the Senate, I get to travel all over the country. Tell you, everywhere you go, people are standing up, they're waking up, they realize what is happening to our country. The same thing is happening today that happened then. The reason I'm optimistic is simple. It is because of each and every one of you. It is because of each of the men and women in this room. If you look to Washington, you'll have nothing but despair and despondency. But if you look to the American people, you'll have hope. And so what I'm trying to do more than anything is energize and empower the American people. You know, each of you has your cell phone. I would encourage you to send a text. To text the word Constitution to the number 33733. I'm going to give that to you again. Text the word Constitution to the number 33733. The only way we're going to turn this country around is building a grassroots army in New Hampshire and in all 50 states across this country. The last thing I want to share with you. For every one of us, liberty is not some abstract concept. It's not something we read about in school books. It's something personal in your family, in my family. It's something that is very real to who we are. You know, in my family, my dad was born in Cuba. And he fought in the revolution as a teenager. Anyone here 14? You're 14. I'm sorry, remind me your name.
Kirsten.
Kirsten? Okay, imagine when my dad was 14, he started fighting in the Cuban Revolution. He was in student council in high school, if you could imagine. And the revolution in Cuba was mostly fought by kids. Anyone here 17? All right, when my dad was 17, he was thrown in prison and tortured. Batista's army beat him almost to death. And he fled Cuba. Anyone here 18? All right, 18. When my dad was 18, he arrived in America. He couldn't speak English. He had nothing but $100 sewn into his underwear. I actually don't advise carrying money in your underwear. And his first job was washing dishes, making 50 cents an hour. Imagine for a second being in a strange country where you know nobody. You're penniless and alone, but you're filled with hopes and dreams and passions. And he ended up paying his way through school at the University of Texas, going on to start a small business. Today, my father's a pastor in Texas. Now, my whole life, my dad has been my hero. But do you know what I find most incredible about his story? How commonplace it is. Every one of us in this room, every single one of us could come up here one at a time and tell a story just like that. Whether it's us or our parents or our great-great-great-grandparents, what ties Americans together is we are the children of those who risked everything for freedom. And that is the fundamental DNA of what it means to be an American. To value freedom and opportunity above all else. Live free or die. That sums up what it means to be an American. And I'll tell you, when I was a kid, my father would say to me over and over again, when we faced oppression in Cuba, I had a place to flee to. If we lose our freedom here, where do we go? That's why the men and women are here, because we will not go quietly into the night. We will rise up together and we will pull back and save this shining city on a hill that is the United States of America.